r/AskReddit. Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? When I was training, I had a guy go into a massive cardiac arrest. We ended up working on him for over an hour and a half because we kept getting him back then losing him again. He had wet himself during the arrest, which is common. It happens. And he just kept apologizing for making a mess. Not a medical worker, but my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemos and one surgery, and overall his prognosis looked really good. He'd gone through another surgery, and he was due to be released from the hospital a couple of days after this story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room, he said, "I'm going to miss you, my love," and obviously she thinks nothing of it, saying, "I'll miss you too. I'll be back in the morning." A couple of hours later he was gone. The morning my stepmother died of cancer, she told me, "Thank you for everything you do for me. As I was her caregiver whenever my father wasn't home. Like your friend, I never thought any of it either, but looking back I'm sure she knew that would be her last morning with me." Not the very last words, but I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would burst into tears, but no, she just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. I've always told patients they may die if things are heading south rapidly. Remind them that we will do everything we can regardless. So far they've all responded just like what you've described. I still question if I'm doing the right thing though. Edit. These individuals were informed after explicitly asking whether they would die or not. I do my best to take everyone's individual preferences into account. I'm gonna fuck why all up, old men who never attended his dialysis appointments. A few hours later we had a fire right by his former room, so despite not being all that worrying at the time, he definitely was the only one that followed through on actually haunting us. Not a medical worker, but I went with my father to say goodbye to my great-uncle, his uncle. He was suffering from dementia and clearly on the way out. He no longer recognized people. My father was an only child and spent most of his time being raised by his uncles, as his father ran a farm all day. Anyway, we're sitting there, and great-uncle is snoozing. He suddenly wakes up and clearly sees my father and starts talking to him about a barn and describing it in great detail. Like, he's talking about where it is, the way the paint was flaking off in one corner, and so on. My father is quieter than normal and just saying yes over and over as he describes the barn. Then, just before great-uncle loses consciousness, he describes going into the barn and setting it on fire. Turns out that my grandfather and great-uncle were having a hell of a dispute at one time and burned down the barn to get back at him. Everyone suspected, but never knew for sure. Edit. Looks like I forgot the last words. Most of them were mumbles, but he spoke about how the fire lit up the night and how it took a while to catch. Nurse. In hospital caring for a 40-ish man with a brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, response to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. My grandpa was similar, struggling to hang on but not responsive. My grandma grabbed his hand and said, "It's okay. You can go, the kids will take care of me." He was gone within the hour. He loved her so much that it wasn't a surprise that he needed her permission to die. Edit. Thank you for the silver. I didn't expect this to blow up as it did. Thank you all for sharing your stories, they were very touching. With wide eyes. Don't listen to my family. They want to keep me around forever, but I just want to die. They won't let me. Edit, she wanted to get off dialysis, which was a death sentence for her. My mom and I cared for my grandmother in her final months. We were at her house pretty much every day, cleaning her up, feeding her, helping her to the restroom, and keeping her company. My grandfather was and is still alive, but he's a shit. We had already done our crying and mourning and were ready to let her go when the time came. When she was clinging to life in the hospital, my aunt and uncles came out of the woodworks. The doctor asked if they should resuscitate and they all emphatically said yes, to do whatever it takes to keep her alive. Basically, they were guilty about not having come around until her final moments, and wanted to drag out her misery to make themselves feel better. My mom and I put our foot down. That's not what Grandma wanted, and it sure as hell wasn't what she deserved. It was a fight, but we won in the end, and she was able to go without a fight when it was time. People can be really selfish assholes. Was one of my grandma's caretakers while she was dying from lymphoma. She lived with my mom. My mom would hear her at night, praying for God to just let her die. She also somehow organized all of her possessions and paperwork so that we would have an easy time handling her affairs. This woman was 90 years old, and she was determined to never be a burden. She never was. It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR, through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you, it's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. My mum passed away a couple of hours after I told her I'd be okay and that it's okay for her to go. I've always hoped that I was able to give her the peace of mind she needed to let go. This is a common occurrence. I'm a tech in a hospital, I've seen this before. Patients pick their moment, often. The first I ever saw as a professional was a guy who said he was scared to die alone when he was lucid. He was DNR. I and my co-workers held his hand for the first 3 hours of my shift, taking turns. His family finally showed up at about 2 a.m. His wife and adopted daughters were there. They went in, and he was dead in 10 minutes. He was waiting for his family to go. He died at 98, with the people he loved, in a warm, comfortable drug bed. We gave him drugs for anxiety and pain, so it was as peaceful as could be. He had a really good death. When I was 13, my grandfather had a heart attack. He hung around for 36 hours. He hung around for the whole family to show up, and then promptly died. Dude was always a fan of having an audience. More recently, I had a guy in his 60s with lung cancer. He was a DNR. His wife said, "Honey, if tonight is the night, that's okay, I understand, I love you and I always will." He gave a thumbs up, smiled, and died 10 minutes later. As a healthcare worker, I firmly believe you helped soothe her at the end. I think of it like falling asleep. You say, "Hey, it's okay, I got it from here," and then they can relax and let it go. Edit, or, thanks for the gold. During my residency, I was on call and running the hospital, as senior residents tend to do. One of my responsibilities was being in charge of the entire ICU, which had about 16-20 bed capacity. I was taking care of a man who had a bowel perforation, a hole in his intestines. He had an nasogastric tube up his nose into his stomach so that he wouldn't drown in his own feces. His brother and sister-in-law came to visit him and they had a nice conversation. I walked in as they were leaving and they said to him, "Make sure to listen to the doctor," as they left. The patient and I talked a bit and he wasn't looking so good. I kept hearing a gurgling sound as he was speaking to me. The kind of sound you make when you rinse out your mouth with mouthwash and spit it out. I immediately checked his NG tube and it came right out. He looked at me and said I shouldn't have played with the tube. Before going pale and losing a pulse, I did everything in my power to save him that day. but his lungs were full of stool and he died 20 minutes later. The rest of the day I felt utterly numb, and it still sits with me to this day. To have a patient smiling and laughing with you one moment, then being deceased 20 minutes later is one hell of a roller coaster ride. Edit: to clear up a few quick points. The NG tube was attached to a canister on the wall and set to suction to help remove contents. And the patient most likely aspirated. Think about when you eat and cough, swallow at the same time and the food goes down the wrong pipe equals airway versus the esophagus. After he pulled his tube out enough that it slipped out of his esophagus and thus allowed the contents to flow down the airway. I hope this clears things up. Sorry for any confusion. And thanks for the great questions and discussion. I'm doing my best to get to them during work. Edit 2, switched esophagus and airway up. Thanks, kind Redditor.